Nothing in this life is free, and when it comes to negotiating with a gang member, this rule applies less than ever, and Bukele had to learn it the hard way. After seeing how his daughter could be gone forever, what was he forced to do? Stay until the end of the video and find out. In his office, Nayib Bukele was deep in thought, going over every detail of the complicated exchange that had secured the release of his daughter, Gabriela. The office, its walls adorned with photos of moments from his presidency, seemed colder and more austere. That night, Bukele, frowning, listened to the echo of his own thoughts while he waited for his trusted officials. The door opened, and Commissioner Diaz, a loyal and efficient man, entered with an expression of obvious concern. "Mr. President, the operation is over. We have recovered your daughter, but the consequences..." Before Diaz could continue, Bukele raised a hand to stop him. "I know what the consequences are," the commissioner said in a firm but tense voice. "The wolf and Cranky are free. My decision was wrong." Diaz, surprised by the direct question, searched for the right words. "Sir, saving your daughter was the priority, but freeing those leaders is a huge risk." Bukele stood up and approached the window, looking at the city lights. "My daughter is safe, but the price has been high. There are no easy decisions in a war like this." He paused, as if searching for the strength to continue. "Diaz, I want you to know that every step we've taken has been with the weight of every Salvadoran life in mind." While we spoke to him in a dark alley in the city, the wolf and Cranky were reunited with their followers. The atmosphere was charged with adrenaline. The leaders, although marked by their time in prison, radiated renewed energy and determination. Their men greeted them with cheers, ready to follow their orders. Presidential office. Bukele turned to face Diaz. "Once again, our response must be swift and decisive. We cannot allow the Maras to reorganize. It must be oriented toward maintaining control." Diaz nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Understood, sir. Intensify operations, and we will close off every possible escape and resupply route." For them, the following days were a whirlwind of activity. The wolf and Cranky, aware that time was of the essence, worked tirelessly to regroup their followers and strengthen their network. They utilized old contacts, opened new routes, and established secret safe houses. Every move was calculated, every action planned with military precision. However, Bukele was not far behind. Under his direction, the security forces carried out raids, confiscated arsenals, and arrested several members of the Mara. The tension in the streets was palpable. The war between the government and the gang was intensifying, and the population watched with fear. In Esperanza, one night during one of his few breaks, Bukele met with his closest team. "We need a long-term strategy. We're not just fighting a gang. We're fighting for the future of our country." His gaze scanned the faces of each of his advisors. "It must be clear that we won't give in." Gabriela's release was a concession, but not a sign of weakness. In the shadows, El Lobo and Cranky also planned their movements. They knew that the key to their success lay in the support of the communities. They began to offer protection and resources to the neediest neighborhoods, gaining the loyalty and support of those the government couldn't reach. With each passing day, their network grew stronger, and their influence grew in the shadows. El Lobo and Cranky also planned their movements. They knew that the key to their success lay in the support of the communities. They began to offer protection and resources to the neediest neighborhoods, the most needy neighborhoods, earning the loyalty and support of those the government could not reach. With each passing day, their network grew stronger and their influence grew. The climax came when El Lobo and Cranky planned a daring attack on a government supply base. The operation, carried out with precision, resulted in a resounding success. They captured weapons, ammunition, and vital resources, inflicting a severe blow to the Bukele regime. This event marked a turning point. The conflict had escalated to a new level, and both sides knew that the future of El Salvador hung in the balance. In his office, Bukele received the news with a mixture of frustration and determination. We cannot allow them to control the narrative. Every setback is an opportunity to demonstrate. Diaz devised a plan to dismantle their network from within. We need infiltration, intelligence, and coordinated action. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, we invite you to watch it. Give us a like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. We continue. Return of the Mara. The days that followed the bold attack of Lobo and Cranky against the government supply base were dark and turbulent in El Salvador. The nation that had begun to feel a glimmer of hope under Bukele's firm leadership was now plunged into a wave of violence and chaos. The sound of sirens and gunfire became omnipresent in San Salvador. Kidnappings became a cruel tool used by gangs to instill fear and exert pressure on the government. Entire families lived in constant fear that their loved ones could be the next to disappear. The violence was not limited to the streets. Even homes that used to be safe havens were transformed into scenes of horror. One night, the Gonzalez family was having dinner when a group of armed men burst into their home. The father, a modest businessman, was kidnapped in front of their terrified children and his desperate wife. The kidnappers left a note. "The government cannot protect you. Only we can." News of these events spread rapidly and was amplified by the media and social networks. Uncertainty and fear took root deeply in Salvadoran society. Schools closed temporarily, and many businesses began to operate under extreme security measures. Trade slowed, and the local economy began to feel the ravages of instability. In his office, Bukele and his team worked tirelessly to counter the growing threat. Every kidnapping, every murder is a direct blow to our credibility. Bukele said in an emergency meeting, "We cannot allow them to take over our streets." Commissioner Diaz, who had witnessed the escalation of violence, presented a plan. "We need a massive operation to dismantle their networks. Infiltrate our agents in the gangs, and we will increase the number of gangs involved. Police presence in the most affected neighborhoods. We must also work with the community to obtain information and support." Bukele agreed. "Do it. We can't waste any more time." Meanwhile, in the shadows, El Lobo and El Crank took advantage of every opportunity to consolidate their power. They used the chaos to their advantage, eliminating rivals and expanding their influence. The violence became methodical and strategic. It was not only about instigating fear, but also about demonstrating their control and ability to challenge the government. In the poorest neighborhoods where the government's presence was weak, gangs began to impose their own laws. They demanded tributes in exchange for protection, and those who refused were brutally punished. People, trapped between the terror of the gangs and the uncertainty of the government, began to lose hope. One afternoon in a small community north of San Salvador, Maria, a single mother saw her 15-year-old son being forcibly recruited by gangs and tried to resist, but was beaten and warned that any attempt to contact the police would result in fatal consequences for her family, with tears in her eyes. Maria resigned herself, knowing that helplessness was her only option. In response to the growing violence, the government intensified its operations. The raids became more frequent and aggressive. Mass arrests were made, and several mid-ranking leaders were captured. However, the Wolf and Cranky always remained one step ahead, anticipating the government's moves and adapting their strategies. In a clandestine meeting, the Wolf spoke with his men. "Bukele is on the ropes, but we must not underestimate him. Our every move must be calculated. It's not just about surviving, but about proving that we are invincible." Cranky, always the brains behind the operations, added, "The key is to maintain constant pressure. We cannot give him any respite. We will use urban guerrilla tactics to wear down his forces." The clashes between government forces and gangs became battlefields. They became increasingly violent. The death toll increased daily, and hospitals filled with the wounded. The population, desperate for a return to normalcy, began to organize into community groups to defend themselves. However, this also made them targets. One night, while patrolling one of the most dangerous neighborhoods, Officer Ramirez, a veteran with more than a decade on the force, was ambushed along with his unit. The ambush, orchestrated by Cranky, was brutal and swift. Ramirez and his men fell under a hail of bullets. The attack was not only a significant loss for law enforcement, but also a clear message. The gangs were not afraid to confront the government directly. At the presidential palace, Bukele received the news with a mixture of anger and determination. "This cannot continue," he said in a grave voice. "We have lost too much. We must regain control. At any cost, Diaz to S. Your side shared their leader's frustration, sir. We need more resources, more men. The fight is unequal, I know, Commissioner. We will do what is necessary." He summons all available resources. This is our last chance to regain control. Bukele's final decision at the presidential palace. The tension was palpable. Bukele and his team had met in an emergency meeting to discuss the critical situation facing the country. The war against gangs had reached a tipping point, and each day brought new tragedies. Bukele took a deep breath before answering. "This is an extreme measure, and I know many will criticize me for it, but we cannot continue with conventional tactics. We need a decisive blow, something that shakes the foundations of these criminal organizations." Silence took over the room. While everyone waited for Bukele to continue, I have been working on a plan that involves our international allies. With your help, we will be able to launch a massive operation to completely dismantle the gang structure. We will not only go after the leaders, but also after their financing, their communication networks, and their logistics. We need to cut off all of their heads at the same time. Bukele held his gaze firmly. We cannot afford to fail. It is not an option. If we do not act now with all our strength and determination, we will be condemning our country to an endless spiral of violence. This is our last chance to restore peace and security to El Salvador. As the meeting dispersed and the team members prepared to execute the plan, Old Lynn, the feared gang member, walked slowly through the narrow corridors of the prison's confinement center. His dark, penetrating eyes did not miss a single detail, assessing every corner, every guard, and every inmate. Since his arrival, his presence had been a constant shadow over the prison. Despite the harsh conditions, never lost Lynn's iron will or his dangerous cunning. Day after day, Lynn watched and listened. He had learned that in the bowels of the CECOT, information was more valuable than any weapon. Over time, he began to draw up a bold and ruthless plan. It wasn't just about escaping, but also about sending a message to President Nayib Bukele, who had sworn to destroy his organization. One dark and rainy night, Lynn summoned his trusted men, all loyal to the death, to the small cell. Under the dim light of a flickering bulb, he outlined his plan. The objective was to kidnap President Bukele's daughter. The silence was profound, filled with disbelief and fear. But when Lynn spoke, his voice was firm and calculated, filling his men with a fierce determination. The first step was to obtain key information about the presidential family's routine within the CECOT. Lynn had an informant, a corrupt guard who needed money to pay his debts in exchange for a considerable sum. The guard began to leak information about the movements of Bukele's daughter, Gabriela. It was learned that every Tuesday and Thursday, she attended an exclusive piano class at a private conservatory, a place where security was less strict. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the CECOT, the gangs were preparing. Armando, one of Inan's most trusted lieutenants, took command and recruited a group of gang members ready to carry out the kidnapping. The team was a well-trained and motivated team, each with their specific role. During the operation, they made sure they had weapons, vehicles, and a safe haven to hide Gabriela once she was captured. On the day of the kidnapping, the atmosphere was tense. The gang took up positions around the conservatory. Armando and two other gang members posed as delivery men for a catering company, taking advantage of an event that it was being celebrated. At the site, two others were waiting in a vehicle parked a few meters from the entrance when Gabriela left the conservatory, accompanied only by a bodyguard. Armando and his team acted with military precision. They quickly overpowered the bodyguard, disarming him and knocking him unconscious. In a nearby alley, in a matter of seconds, Gabriela was forced into the vehicle, which started with a squeal of tires inside the building. Old Lin waited calmly. Disquieted, he knew that at that moment, the fate of his plan depended on the skill and loyalty of his men. Receiving the signal that the operation had been a success allowed a smile to cross his face. However, the real challenge was just beginning. The news of Gabriela Bukele's kidnapping exploded like a bomb throughout El Salvador. The media, social networks, and public opinion turned to a frantic coverage. Nayib Bukele, furious and desperate, mobilized all security forces to find his daughter. The situation was extremely delicate, and any step in the right direction would be jeopardized. It could have consequences for the slashing of their hiding place. The U.S. Marera treated Gabriela with surprising respect. She was a valuable asset and, in a way, life insurance for them. Armando was in charge of communicating Ellen's demands to the government, the release of several gang leaders, and safe passage out of the country. The negotiations were tense, and time was a relentless enemy within the CECOT. Attention was also palpable. President Bukele, with no other option, agreed to negotiate. He knew that his daughter's safety was above any campaign principle or promise. However, he was also planning a covert operation to recover Gabriela without giving in to Lin's demands. The days passed, and the negotiations continued in a tense back and forth. Finally, an exchange was agreed upon in a remote location. From his cell, Lin oversaw every detail of the plan. The Mars handed Gabriela over safely. But before they could celebrate their victory, they were ambushed by government special forces. The operation was swift and lethal. Armando and several gang members fell in the confrontation. Although Gabriela was rescued, Lin had managed to send a clear and terrifying message, even from behind bars. His power and influence were unshakable. Bukele's measures. The news of Gabriela Bukele's rescue was greeted with relief throughout El Salvador. However, for Old Man Lin and the Maras, the victory had been short-lived. The covert operation by the government special forces had been devastating. Armando and several of his men had fallen in the confrontation, and the survivors were arrested and returned to the CECOT. With an even higher level of security in his cell, Old Man Lin watched the cold glow of a moon through a small window in his cell. He knew that his time was numbered. Enraged and determined to crush any hint of resistance, he had ordered exemplary punishment for Lin and the remaining Mara leaders. President Bukele was quick to act, with the support of the public and the international community. For his part, he intensified security measures at the CECOT. Lin was moved to an even more restrictive cell, isolated by his followers. Visits were reduced to a strict minimum, severely limiting his ability to communicate with the outside world. In addition to isolation, he ordered a comprehensive review of the conditions inside the CECOT. The government implemented draconian measures aimed at weakening the Mara's influence within the prison. They reduced inmate privileges, confiscated illicit property, and increased security measures. Throughout the complex, it was a silent but relentless war against the gang and its leader personally. Nayib Bukele was more determined than ever to put an end to Old Man Lin and his criminal legacy. In press conferences and public speeches, he bluntly denounced the threat the gangs posed to national security and the well-being of the country. He promised a relentless fight against organized crime, using all the resources at his disposal to achieve this. For Lin, each day became a battle for survival and sanity. The oppressive routine and constant surveillance wore him down physically and mentally. However, his indomitable spirit continued to burn within him. Although secretly, he planned strategies to maintain cohesion within his gang and prepare for an eventual return of power. Meanwhile, the pressure on the gang continued unabated. Police and military operations intensified in areas controlled by the gang. Mass arrests and seizures of drugs and weapons became a strategy. Every day, the government sought to weaken the Mara's structure from its foundations, cutting off any possibility of resurgence. As the months passed, the situation became unsustainable for the Mara. The strength of the government and Nayib Bukele's determination to eradicate organized crime began to bear fruit. Little by little, the Mars' influence inside and outside the CECOT faded. Their numbers diminished. Their operations became more clandestine, and the figure of Old Man Lin went from being a feared legend to a declining prisoner. By the way, if you enjoy the video, we invite you to give us your like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. We continue the beginning of the end after the direct confrontation between President Nayib Bukele and Old Man Lin. In the CECOT prison, the campaign against gangs in El Salvador intensified. Bukele, determined to eradicate the influence of the gangs in the country, ordered an unprecedented search and capture operation specifically targeting members of the gang. The operation, dubbed Mano Dura, was ultimately designed to be swift, effective, and brutal. The deployment of police and military forces was massive. Troops and armored vehicles patrolled the streets of cities and towns where the gangs were known to operate. Helicopters constantly flew over the most conflict-ridden areas, using advanced surveillance technology to track gang members. The raids were carried out with military precision, with elite teams breaking into homes and hideouts at any time of day or night. The slogan was clear: no gang member should escape. Authorities had lists with names and photos of suspects, and each capture was a trophy to show the public. Newscasts broadcast the raids live, showing the gang members being arrested and taken handcuffed to police vehicles. Bukele wanted everyone to see the power of the state in action and understand that there would be no truce. The treatment of captured gang members was harsh, bordering on inhumane, during the raids. They showed no mercy. The orders were clear: intimidate, humiliate, and punish the gang members from the moment of their capture. The prisoners were beaten out of their hiding places, dragged through the streets, and thrown into police vehicles without any regard for their well-being. In the temporary detention centers, the situation did not improve. The gang members were subjected to brutal interrogations to extract information about their operations and contacts. Physical violence was a common tactic. Beatings, kicks, and the use of tools to inflict pain were part of the process. The prisoners were deprived of sleep and food, kept in overcrowded and filthy cells where desperation and fear reigned. The transfers to the CECOT mega prison were another episode of terror for the gang members. Chained and crammed into trucks, they were transported for hours under the blazing sun without food or water. The guards made sure to maintain an atmosphere of constant oppression with shouts, insults, and blows that never stopped. Many arrived at the cot already wounded and weakened, barely able to stand. Upon reaching the CECOT, the reception was even more brutal. The prisoners were forced to run through a kind of gauntlet formed by guards armed with batons and sticks. Each step toward the prison entrance was accompanied by blows and kicks. The already hellish conditions inside the CECOT worsened with each new group of prisoners that arrived. The overcrowded cells, lack of hygiene, and the constant threat of violence made life in the prison hell. Meanwhile, Bukele continued his media campaign, using social media and the media to showcase the results of the operations, assuring the public that the government was taking drastic measures to restore peace and security. Images of captured gang members and the destruction of their hiding places became symbols of state power. Bukele presented himself as the strong and determined leader that El Salvador needed to free itself from the yoke of the gangs. Bukele stood alone in the room looking at a map. El Salvador knew that what he was about to do would change the destiny of his country. The criticism would be fierce and the path would be full of obstacles. But he also knew there was no other option. In the darkness of his office, Bukele muttered to himself, "I'm going to deal them a blow they won't be able to recover from. And when I do, this country will finally be able to find the peace it so richly deserves." And so we come to the end of this video. If you liked it, I invite you to give us a like so we can continue making more videos like this. Also, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our new videos. I wish you a great day. Until next time.